Hello everyone and welcome back to the Airfix YouTube channel. In this video we're going to be building another hypercar. This time it's the 1/43 scale Bugatti Chiron Starter Set from Airfix. This is another one of the new Airfix starter sets which has been engineered from the ground up to have a reduced parts count and an improved build sequence, making it perfect for beginners. And because it's a starter set, it comes complete with glue, a paintbrush and 4 acrylic paints to paint your model. On the back of the kit box you'll find full colour diagrams with colour callouts for the included paints to help you paint the kit. In the small red boxes you'll find placement instructions for the supplied markings. Inside the box you'll find a bag containing 2 frames of red injection moulded plastic and a single piece body shell. Also in this bag you'll find a separately wrapped clear frame which includes the windscreen, the headlights and the rear screens for the vehicle. In a smaller bag you'll find 4 Humbrol acrylic paints and a tube of Humbrol polycement, and of course we have the Humbrol Airfix paintbrush to paint the model. The instruction sheet details the construction process from start to finish, and it's important that you give this a good read before you start the project, as there are many areas on the model that won't be accessible when you get later into the build. We've removed our frames from the bags and prepared them in line with the before you start guide, giving all of the parts a good wash with a soft paintbrush and some washing up liquid to make sure that the surface is free of any potential contaminants. This can help with the adhesion of your paint later on when you're painting the model kit, as we're not going to be using a primer in this video. To put the kit together we'll be using the usual Humbrol beginners tool set, which is a basic set of modelling tools that's great for getting started in the hobby and includes a file, some tweezers, a set of cutters and a modelling knife. Each of the kit components is identified with a letter and a number which is moulded into a small square tab next to the parts themselves on the frame. These part numbers are referenced in the round callouts in the instructions, along with a small paintbrush callout telling you which colour the parts need to be painted. The blue areas on the instructions tell you where to apply the polycement in order to glue the kit together. To remove the kit parts from the frame, we're using the cutters, but we're not cutting right up against the surface of the parts. We're leaving a small piece of plastic protruding, as this prevents the cutters from damaging any of the surface detail. This small piece of excess plastic can then be trimmed away easily with the modelling knife before switching to the file to remove any leftover and leave us with a nice smooth surface. This prevents any leftover plastic from interfering with the fit of the kit parts themselves. This may not be a big deal on detail parts such as the seats, however on some of the larger, more structural components such as the main interior tub, this could interfere with the fit of the body shell later on and leave us with some unsightly gaps in the model, so it's important that we give these parts a thorough clean up and make sure the surface is nice and smooth. To check that there's no interference, we can test by fitting the model together with no glue in a process commonly referred to as dry fitting. We've not applied any polycement at this point, we're just testing to make sure everything fits. After removing and cleaning up all of the parts for step 1 in the instructions, we need to begin painting before we can begin assembly, and we're going to start with number 19, which is gloss red. The paint in your kit may have been sat on the shelf at the model shop for some time before it reached your bench, so give the paint a good stir first to make sure that you've undone any separation and that it's nice and smooth again, before transferring some paint into a palette and then adding some ordinary tap water. This additional water will help the paint to smoothly self-level on the surface of the model and avoid any 3-dimensional texture. It does reduce the power of the paint's coverage, and that just means we'll have to build it up in multiple thin layers. After thinning the paint down, we can commence painting with our initial layer of gloss red, and at this point we're not too worried about coverage, we're more interested in getting a nice smooth initial coat of paint down on the model just to get things started and help with the adhesion of the paint on the subsequent layers. When painting the smaller parts on a kit like this, we like to mount them on a small blob of white tack adhesive so we can paint them all over with no risk of getting any fingerprints in the paint. After leaving the initial coat of gloss red to dry, you can see it's finished up quite streaky and blotchy, but that's not an issue as that was only the initial layer, and we're going to apply a second coat over the top to smooth everything out. The same dilution of paint is used and we apply this directly over the top of the previous layer, and because we're no longer painting over bare plastic, you'll find that adhesion is much easier and more straightforward, and we can quickly add the second layer over the interior and all of the smaller detail parts such as the seats and the door cards. With the second layer of gloss red drying, we're going to switch to number 33 matte black, and we're going to prepare the paint in exactly the same way, giving it a good stir before transferring it to the palette and adding about 40% ordinary tap water. Again, the additional water will just help the paint to dry more smoothly and without any three-dimensional texture. Using the instructions as a guide for where to put the matte black, we can start applying this nice contrasting colour into all of the correct areas. Just like when we applied the gloss red, the initial coat will be quite streaky and won't cover very well, but we don't need to worry about this, we just need to focus on getting a nice smooth layer of paint down, and in this case we also need to focus on getting a nice neat demarcation line between the two different colours. After the initial coat of black has dried, we can go ahead and solidify the colour with a second coat to get everything looking nice and solid, and again we just need to take a bit of extra care along that line where the two colours meet, just to make sure we keep it as neat as possible. While we've got gloss red and matte black in the palette, we may as well skip forward a step in the instructions and paint the dashboard ready for when we get to that part of the build. Because matte black covers so much more strongly than red, we'll paint the red areas first and then we'll tidy up the join between these two colours using the black. After applying an initial coat of matte black over the majority of the part, we can work our way towards the seam line between the two colours and then focus on getting a nice neat demarcation line between the black and the red. Don't be too disheartened if this looks a little bit scruffy at first, as the initial coat of matte black will always be streaky and blotchy, and it's not until you apply the second layer and build up some solid coverage that the contrast between these two colours really starts to pop. Using the last little bit of matte black left in the palette, we're now going to base coat the engine details. These need to be painted silver before we put the model together, but a layer of matte black before the silver just helps to bring out the shine and gives that colour a bit more of a lustre than painting it over a red base coat. So we're going to give the engine details 2 layers of matte black before we switch to silver to finish off the painting in these areas. The silver paint is prepared in exactly the same fashion with a good stir first, and then using the instructions as a guide for application, we're going to pick out the necessary details in silver. The trickiest part of this process is painting the instrument strip down the middle of the dashboard. This is quite a tricky detail and it's very fine, so we just use the tip of the brush to pick out the necessary areas, and any areas where the silver overspilled we can tidy up with just a little bit more black just to neaten the edges. The engine was given 2 good layers of silver to block this detail in and get it looking nice and shiny, as this is quite a visible detail on the model once it's completed. With all of the painting complete for the first stages, we need to think about assembling the parts that we've painted using the Humbrol polycement supplied with the kit. Polycement isn't an ordinary glue, it works by melting the plastic together, and that means that if you get it where you don't want it, it can damage the surface of the model, leaving unsightly marks and damaging your paint finish. Because polycement is supplied in a small metal tube with quite a broad nozzle, it's not really ideal to try and apply this directly from the tube onto the model surface. To give yourself a bit more control over where the polycement goes, why not try cutting the corner from the kit box using a couple of passes of the modelling knife to create an applicator, and then cutting one of the wings from the box top to create a small pallet onto which the polycement can then be placed, and then the applicator can be used to transfer the polycement from the pallet onto the model's surface. Let's put this into practice now and go ahead and start applying some polycement to the first of the parts which need to be assembled in stage 1 of the instructions. We'll transfer some cement to the underside of the seat and then press this into position on the moulded location tab in the lower portion of the interior. It's important to remember that polycement provides a permanent join, so we need to make sure these parts are pressed right down into their final resting place, as we don't want to have to try and move them afterwards. The process was then repeated for the second seat, with polycement being added using the applicator, before pressing the parts firmly into their final location and allowing the polycement to grip for a few seconds, and once that was done, the seats were in place. Moving on to the door sections, we applied polycement in the areas which are shown in blue on the instructions, as well as on the locating tab on the door sections themselves. Once the polycement has been applied, we can carefully guide these parts into place, making sure not to spread the cement onto any of the painted surfaces, damaging our finish, and then we can hold them in place for a few seconds while the glue does its work. This is the basic technique for applying polycement and assembling the parts for the kit, and we'll use the same technique throughout the rest of the build. After beginning assembly of the interior, we encountered the first of the required transfers from the supplied marking sheet to represent the instruments on the dial cluster of the dashboard. The markings don't work like stickers, and the required transfer has to be cut free from the backing paper using a modelling knife before being picked up with tweezers and then immersed into ordinary tap water for a few seconds and then set aside to soak. The water being applied to the transfer sheet will reactivate the adhesive on it and allow the transfer to move free under gentle pressure from a paintbrush when it's ready to be applied. When the transfer starts to slide around on the backing paper, we can prepare the surface of the model, again with just a bit of ordinary water, as this will allow for repositioning once the transfer is in place. Because we've applied the water, we don't need to worry too much about getting the position right first time, as we can move it about gently with the paintbrush without causing any issues. Once the position's sorted, we can use a small piece of tissue to soak away any excess water, and the marking is in position. Once the rest of the steering wheel assembly is glued to the dashboard, it's time to manoeuvre that whole sub-assembly into position and close off the front of the interior. Some polycement is added as shown in the instructions, and then the dashboard assembly is pushed into place and held for a few seconds while the polycement takes hold. The final piece on the interior assembly sees us moving to the clear frame for the rear screens. Working with the clear styrene is the same as working with the red coloured plastic. However, it is a bit more brittle, so we take more care when removing from the frame and cleaning up. And also, we have to take a bit more care when installing the parts, as we want to keep these areas free from fingerprints and scratches, as they're supposed to represent glass on the finished model. As an optional addition to the painting instructions supplied with the kit, we decided to enhance the engine detail by heavily diluting some of the matte black paint with water to create a wash, and then flowing this mixture into the recessed details on the engine. This helps to break up the silver paint and gives the whole area a bit more shade and depth. If you get any of the wash in an area that you don't want it to be, such as here where it's sitting on the surface, you can simply clean the brush on some tissue and then use the dry bristles to absorb the wash away, thus giving you control over where the black paint goes. You can see that when you close the body shell, the engine is quite a prominent detail, so adding this wash just helps the detail jump out a little bit more. Moving on to the next stage of the build, we painted the brakes while the parts were still attached to the frame, just so we could keep track of which part number was which. The brake discs were painted first with black to enhance the coming coats of silver paint, and we did this on the rear as well, just in case any of the red plastic would be visible from certain angles when viewing the model. After the black paint was allowed to dry, 2 coats of silver paint were added to the brake disc, before we moved on to the gloss red to touch in the calipers. With the brake discs painted, we moved on to the underside of the car and gave this part a coat of matte black which had been diluted with about 40% tap water. Some of these areas will be visible on the finished model, so we made sure to paint in around all of the wheel arches, and the matte black coat would also act as a great base for the gloss black on the air intakes, which will be visible on the sides of the finished model. After the initial coat of black was dry, we applied a second layer, making sure to cover up all of the plastic under the wheel arches, as these areas would be really inaccessible once the wheels were fitted, and we didn't want any red plastic showing through. While the matte black was still wet in the palette, we skipped forward a step and covered the front intakes with matte black paint, just to act as a base coat for the gloss black which is required on this part later on. The air intakes were then painted with 2 coats of number 21 gloss black, which had again been thinned with the addition of about 40% tap water. This was allowed to dry fully before moving on to applying the polycement on the mounting locations for the brake discs, and then the brake and axle assemblies were pushed into position, holding them carefully to avoid getting any glue on the axles. More polycement was then added in the areas shown in the instructions, and the whole interior assembly was manoeuvred into place. Once this had been pushed down and located firmly, it was held in position until the glue had securely set, and then this whole assembly was put aside as we moved on to the main body shell. This is obviously the most visible part of the model, so assembly in this area was carried out with the utmost care not to get any extra glue on the outside faces of the model kit. After applying the rear quarters and the rear screen divider, we glued the back bumper into position and then mounted the whole body shell assembly on a stick using some tape and some white tack adhesive so we could move it around without getting our fingers near the wet paint. With the palette loaded with gloss red, diluted with the usual 40% water, we start to apply the initial coat of paint over the front portion of the car. Because we're painting a water-based acrylic directly onto bare plastic, there are likely to be some areas where surface tension prevents the paint from sticking to the model at first. In these areas we use short fast strokes of the brush to overcome the surface tension, and we just try to get a nice smooth layer of paint down in anticipation of a second and then third coat, which will build up a more solid colour coverage and a nice gloss shine. It's important that we allow the paint to dry fully in between layers, as painting over a layer which hasn't cured properly may lift the paint, causing some dreaded 3-dimensional texture to appear in the finish. With the front of the car painted in 3 layers of gloss red and then allowed to dry, we moved on to the rear of the vehicle, which needs to be painted black. To give the gloss black paint in this area a bit of a head start, we applied 2 coats of matte black first as a base coat. This would just help cover up all the red plastic first, and means we have to use fewer layers of gloss black just to build up a good shine without worrying about coverage. Where the red and black paint meet, we have to paint in a nice neat demarcation line, and then we also painted the inside of the window frames, as these would be visible when the clear parts are fitted. Once the initial coat of matte black is dry, we can go ahead and start to apply a second layer, and already you can see that the red plastic is starting to disappear under some nice solid colour coverage. For newer modelers, this head start in coverage is really useful when it comes to painting in the finer areas down near the air intakes, as it simply means you don't have to repeat the process as many times. With the base coat completely dry, we can mix up some number 21 gloss black with the usual 40% water to thin it down, and then start to apply our gloss black layers over the top of the matte black base coat. After one application, you can see that there's a sheen starting to creep into the finish, and we'll build this up into a really glossy shine on these areas with the application of a second and third coat over the top. After 3 coats of gloss black, with the paint allowed to dry fully in between applications, we were left with a really nice shine to the black areas of the vehicle, and it was time to move on to the last painting stage with the body shell, which is to touch in the silver trim around the doors. This can be a bit of a tricky process, so if you're new to building model kits, you may want to skip this step and come back later when you're a bit more confident to paint this detail in. The trim is moulded into the kit as a raised detail, so you can drag the side of the brush along this area, allowing the silver paint to transfer. Once the initial coat has been applied, you can come back with a second layer using the tip of the brush just to solidify the colour and build up a neater layer of paint along the trim's surface. Once all of the trim is painted in and given a second coat just to solidify it, if there are any areas which need a tidy up, we can always come back with the gloss black paint that we've got left over from painting the body shell and just tidy up these areas with a quick application to get rid of any unwanted silver marks. After setting the body shell aside to dry completely, we can work on some of the final details for the model. We're going to start with the headlights, which will give a quick clean up while they're still attached to the frame, before mixing some silver paint with quite a bit of tap water to create a wash, and then flowing this into the recesses on the rear of the part. While that wash is drying, we can mix up some number 33 matte black, and we can paint in the lower portion of the windscreen with a couple of coats just to give this a good solid coverage. Once the silver wash is completely dry, we can paint over the back of the headlights with 2 coats of matte black paint, trapping the silver inside and leaving it only visible from the front of the part. This is a great way to enhance the detail on the headlights of this car, making it look a little bit more like the box art on the front of the kit. The body shell is then placed on some tissue to protect the paintwork, and we add polycement in the areas shown in the instructions to hold the windscreen parts in place, which are then removed from the clear frame. Taking care to only hold these clear parts by areas which won't be visible on the finished model, we can move it into its initial position before switching to using an ordinary cotton bud to safely apply pressure to the clear parts without risking adding any scratches or fingerprints to the glass. After pressing down with the cotton bud, there's a small click as the windows locate themselves into the body shell, and we just need to then brush any extra dust off the top of the model from the tissue paper. With the windscreen part in place, the body shell is ready to receive the grills and the front bumper, which we painted in number 21 gloss black, and we can also fit the headlights, which are now completely dry. Polycement was then added to the lower half of the model to hold the body shell, and we concentrated the application of the glue towards the inside of the model so that it doesn't squeeze out onto our finished surface when the body shell is pressed into place. The body shell can then be manoeuvred into position, and it will click over the rear wheel arch before settling on the pegs at the front, where we hold it for a few seconds while the glue does its work. After assembling the wheels, these were given an overall coat of number 33 matte black as a base for the silver paint, which we applied using the side of the brush to just catch the outside face of the wheels. This is an attempt to create a more diamond cut appearance, as shown on the wheels on the box art on the front of the kit. By turning the brush on its side and allowing it to catch only the outside face, we're able to concentrate the silver only in these areas, leaving the rest of the wheel in matte black. Don't worry if there are any areas where the silver paint goes astray, as these can be tidied up with an additional application of matte black just to get everything looking nice and neat. And we can do this around the tyre and also around any of the faces of the alloy where the silver paint's gone into a location where we don't want it. With all of the wheels fully painted and allowed to dry, we need to add polycement just to the very end of the axle and push the wheels into position. This is a really easy stage in the build, but we are working with polycement near the surface of our painted model, so we just need to be careful that we don't get any glue on the surface of the kit, ruining our nice finish. The mirrors were painted while still attached to the frame, and then after cutting our applicator down to a tiny sliver, we put a small dot of polycement in the recess on the body shell and pushed the mirrors into position, completing the assembly of the model. The final stage in the build is to add the supplied markings to the exterior, and we did this in exactly the same way as shown earlier in the video, preparing the surface first with some water to allow for repositioning. The trickiest marking to apply is the thin red strip for the rear lights, and to get this transfer in place we pinned one end in place with the brush as we gradually removed the marking paper and then carried out final positioning, moving that transfer around in the water on the surface of the model. Once all of the transfers are allowed to dry, that's the Bugatti Chiron Starter Set fully complete. For someone who's new to the world of scale modelling, a subject like the Bugatti Chiron might be quite a daunting prospect. But by offering this vehicle in the starter set format, with its reduced parts count and a build sequence aimed specifically at beginners, Airfix hope to open the door on this fascinating hobby to people worldwide who just want to build a replica of their favourite vehicles. By providing videos such as this one, we also hope to provide inspiration and guidance on the basic techniques required to finish your model to a standard you'll be absolutely delighted with. So thank you for joining us for some modelling today, and as always, we'll see you again next time.